Okay, great. We're going to have a conversation today about something that's new and really important to the board at Men Having Babies, which is to give parents, parents tools to go out to agencies and clinics to help them understand what the ethics of the process are. And you know, there are existing ethical frameworks for the law through the American Bar Association and through the medical community through ASRM, but really there's nothing for parents to have to go to their clinics and to be armed with with a set of principles to approach the surrogacy journey. We realized this. I realized this a while ago, to just tell a personal story. When my husband and I had our child, we were followed by a documentary crew from CNN. Come on in, Brian. We were followed by a documentary crew, and they basically followed us through the entire course of our journey. And we did a promotional event at CNN headquarters in New York. It was produced by CNN, to the gay group in CNN Atlanta, the main center in Atlanta. And they did a Q&A afterwards. And one of the members of the group said, "It seems very selfish of you to go through this process when you could just adopt. Why didn't you just adopt?" And it was a really interesting question, as though, first of all, we as gay parents didn't have the right to have our own biological children. And for me, honestly, I think some of his response may have been tied up in something going on with him. But I asked him if his sister had fertility issues, and if her only means of having biological children was either through IVF or surrogacy, would he have the same concerns with her? So I think the baseline premise is that we all have the right to have our own biological children. And that's one of the reasons why we created this. Also, we created this in response to our experience in Brussels this year. I probably should not have been taken surprised by the response that we had, but we had protesters there. We had very negative news coverage there when they hadn't spoken with us. We had a whole system of responses. Hey, come on in. We had a whole system of responses of, this was baby selling, and this was taking advantage of women, and there was socialized medicine issues. You're paying for something that you should have the right to. And we realized that we needed to be able to respond to that, and we needed to be able to give our intended parents the ability to respond to that. So, and also an immediate need here in New York. Come on in. Our immediate need here in New York to pass the Child Parent Security Act, which has been stalled for 3 years now, and possibly one of the reasons is the lack of understanding about the possibility of good, positive regulation for the surrogacy industry. And if we can, as intended parents, help the legislature, certainly through the agencies that we work with, understand the ethical journey, then that's the reason why we're doing this. So I want to explain the draft components, and if you have a copy, the draft is right here. Everybody has a copy, I think.
Do you mind just reintroducing this?
Yes.
Very briefly, some of us.
That's absolutely. For the people who weren't in here, we're introducing today our proposed framework for ethical surrogacy for intended parents. And it's specific for the intended parents. It's not for the legal community, it's not for the medical community, it's for parents undergoing the journey so that they understand what the ethics are around surrogacy, and that they have the ability to go to their agencies and their clinics and ask for an ethical journey themselves. So the components of the draft that we have, which, by the way, we welcome you to go online, menhavingbabies.org. I think it's /advocacy, and then you can click onto the ethical guidelines. On that page, there's also a SurveyMonkey. I think it's SurveyMonkey. But you're able to actually put your comments in about the draft yourself, and we welcome all of those comments because we want there to be a consensus. But there's different sections to it. There's 4 sections to it. First, there's a definitions section on the first page, where we basically give you the very basic definitions for terms such as intended parents, surrogate, egg donor, your coordinating agency, clinic, attorney, the surrogacy journey, which we use that word a lot, but we define it here. and finalization, which is establishing parental rights for the non-biological parent. We go in next into our statement of principles, which we really enlisted to a great degree our surrogates advisory board. We have a board of very active surrogate mothers who read through the draft and who assisted us. And the statement of principles really addresses the foundation on which we want to build the ethical guidelines. For instance, the first is that surrogacy should be legally allowed as a parenting option to individuals, single or coupled, that lack the reproductive capacity to become parents without the help of a surrogate. And that certainly includes gay men. We also, as a statement of principle, believe that women everywhere should have the right to decide when, how, and under which circumstances they agree to help intended parents by donating eggs or carrying a baby for them. And we also go forward to advocate for appropriate legislation that should be advanced to allow prospective parents, donors, surrogates everywhere to enter into legally enforceable agreements for surrogacy arrangements without the need to cross state or international borders. And one of the things that we heard from the surrogates on our surrogate advisory board is, the relationship with the intended parents is really crucial, and everybody at the conference today has talked about how crucial that is. But for instance, New York couples, when we have to travel so far, the relationship that we have with our surrogate moms and their families is limited either to Skype or to what we can afford for a travel budget. Available here in New York would enhance the relationship. The relationship that we've heard from our surrogate moms is so important to having a meaningful and an ethical journey. I just want to highlight the fifth step, which states that steps should be taken, including appropriate regulation, to limit the medical risks donors and surrogates are subjected to during the surrogacy process. I think we've seen what has happened in India and Nepal and Thailand, where there hasn't been adequate regulation, there hasn't been appropriate steps taken to protect the needs of the surrogate moms. So we really want to state upfront in our statement of principles that this is something that is very important to us, and it's very important to our surrogates moving forward. I want to move on to, and yes?
Yeah, I just have a question. So the first point under the principles, the definition you provide does not include women who simply do not desire to become pregnant themselves. Why do you not include that?
We do include that, and we do include that later on, because the way that we're layering this, we have a statement of principles upon which the ethics are based. We have the guidelines are based. We have baseline protocols that are really the minimum that we want clinics and agencies to adopt so that we will work with them. They can be part of our directory and they can be part of the GPAP program. But then we have, and getting a long way around to answering your question, we have a section at the end of best practices, which we really believe are standards that we can hold ourselves to. We don't necessarily hold clinics and agencies to, but as intended parents, we want to understand the best possible route for this. And in that, we do state that we believe that, and that's why we talk about people who lack the reproductive capacity, as opposed to what's called social surrogacy, which I think what you're talking about, women who simply don't want to go through the pregnancy process. And in our best practices section, we go into actually not really believing that that is part of the ethical journey. We're not ruling it out, but for our purposes, for the intended parents, for men having babies, because we as gay men do lack the reproductive capacity, that's included in the best practices, and it's something that we don't necessarily advocate for.
And just to be clear, 95% of people don't do for social reasons. Women also, it's because of medical or psychological reasons that they would not.
Yeah, it is a very small, thank you, it's a very small component of the kind of the surrogates experience for women who use surrogates. So those are the basic components. The baseline protocols are requirements for participation in MHB, men having babies events, and in GPAP. And the best practices are what we want parents to consider if desired. and request of their service providers, and hopefully their service providers will be open to that. And this section we do, we got substantial input from our Surrogates Advisory Board also for the best practices, because we really want to hold the standards that the surrogates would hold us to. So I want to talk a little bit about the statement of principles. We went through a little bit about it. There's, again, I want to go back to, there's an apparent obviousness about the first statement, that surrogacy should be legal. But we really are. One of the things that I think anybody who's been through the experience will tell you, and Greg, let me know if you feel the same way, you become sort of an advocate and an educator about surrogacy when you're an intended parent, and when you go through the process. People really want to get as much information from you as possible. And you really do start talking to people, and in talking to them, we discovered that there are a lot of misconceptions that are out there. There are a lot of people who believe that surrogacy is taking advantage of a woman, and they don't understand that surrogates approach agencies to become surrogates because they want to do something fulfilling. They want to help other people who can't have a family. So these basic kind of misconceptions we want to be able to address, and we want to give our intended parents the ability to answer those questions and to respond to those people who think it's selling a baby or buying a baby, or think that it's taking advantage of a woman somehow. So that is, again, an underlying principle. And also, I mentioned a little bit earlier, what I noticed, or what we discovered in Brussels, was that there was also an element of why should we have to pay for something that is part of our right as a citizen? Medical services are part of socialized medicine. And here in America, we have a completely different view of what that is. Hello. I'd mentioned the fifth statement. While this seems obvious, the regulation of medical risks to donors and carriers, there are real-world effects that this may have on an intended parent's journey, because with a dearth of surrogates, screening people out seems kind of counterproductive. And so we want to ask our parents, are you willing then to wait perhaps 6 months longer to ensure that the carrier that you get passes the kind of heightened screening that we're talking about? What, as an intended parent, what concessions will you make to the journey? What additions will you make possibly to the budget of the journey to ensure that there's an ethical process in screening and in obtaining the perfect surrogate for you? Which is a really interesting concept. And for intended parents out there, we want your feedback about that. We want to understand what, would you create room in your budget if it meant that the appropriate steps were being taken to ensure that a really ethical journey was being taken? And it's a kind of a complicated question, a lot, as probably many of the people in the budgeting seminar would tell you. The seventh statement of principles, which is on the bottom of the second page, we talk about monetary compensation not being tied to specific outcomes. And we want to ask the question to intended parents: how would you feel about compensation for your surrogate mother if you went through the second trimester and she miscarried? Should her compensation change? Is that going to be set out in the contract? These are questions that we definitely want intended parents to ask their agencies about what would happen if. And should the journey be based on a baby at the end of the journey, or should the compensation be based on the journey itself? Which is a really interesting and complicated question, but I think it does address some of the concerns that people have had in Thailand and in India and in other countries where surrogates have been taken advantage of, to make sure that the journey is tied, that the compensation is tied to the journey. And the last one, which is the last one I want to talk about in the statement of principles, is number 8. It's on page 3, and it's about compensation guidelines. And this is a big, I think, a big topic right now because of the class action suit brought by egg donors against the ASRM guideline cap. Is this going to create a financial incentive in a donor or in a carrier that's going to outweigh their altruistic intention. You know, as I mentioned earlier in one of the first sessions, we defined surrogacy in our basic session as an altruistic act by a woman because there's always been some reason why she's entered into this journey, and it's been based on a personal story or a desire to help somebody else have a child. I've never heard a surrogate mother or an egg donor say, you know, we're going through this whole intense medical process, you know, just for the money. And that's a huge red flag, and that's something that I think most agencies can screen out pretty quickly also. But if there is a cap, and I would like to open this up to everybody out there. I mean, from different perspectives, from the intended parent's perspective, from the provider's perspective, if we remove the cap and it becomes a race to the top, how do you think that's going to affect the intention of a donor or a surrogate?
So the question is, if you have the cap on there, you're basically creating a situation where intended parents can't compete monetarily for a limited supply.
Well, we're looking at it sort of from the other direction,
Okay.
as the incentive for the donor and the incentive for the carrier. If there is not a cap on there, and intended parents can buy their way up, is that going to affect the intention of the donor and of the surrogate mother? And is that something that, and I think maybe, and I'm sorry I interrupted you, but maybe you can fill in the blanks for the intended parents. How would that change your idea of what the journey is? Do you find the cap sort of reassuring that it's bringing in people who want to do it for the right reasons, or do you feel like you should be able to compensate a donor or a carrier, whatever is being charged? What do you
I
think?
think it's an interesting question because there is a clearing and it is a market at the end of the day. It was interesting, I was in one of the sessions and they were saying that surrogates will go on online forums, describe their circumstances, where they live, what they can provide, their age, whether they've had kids before, and then fellow surrogates will help approximate what their value is,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an efficient market, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
When you put a cap on that, you're sort of distorting it a little bit. But this question, and I'm just thinking off the cuff, this question of tying it back to altruism is sort of interesting, and I wonder if there's a blueprint for that in any other sort of market, quote unquote, or service that's provided.
Well, the ASRM guidelines establish the cap that's being challenged in court right now, and that's, I think,
And to be clear, that's just on egg donors.
that is just on egg donors,
And
right?
There's actually, interestingly, there's not a shortage of egg donors. I mean, there's a shortage of surrogates, but there are more women who are interested in being egg donors than people who, you know, need the services of an egg donor. So, you know, every egg donation contract I've ever seen, you know, says that the donor is not being compensated for her genetic material, that she's being compensated for her, you know, time, inconvenience, risk, you know, the pain, things like that involved. So to me, the question is, you know, if those things are finite and quantifiable, and you're going above that $10,000, what's the criteria that, you know, that is going to be based on, you know, like who gets more? You know, it's not somebody who says, no, I've looked at the risks and you have to pay me $20,000 for the risk. It's going to be the woman who went to Harvard, you know, or who's a model, or, you know, has whatever criteria that, you know, that people find to be valuable. So I you know, as a lawyer who works in this area, I have a little bit of concern about removing that ASRM
Yeah.
cap.
Yeah, I'll tell you what our position is, and this was heavily influenced by our Surrogate Advisory Board, is that we think that compensation capping regulation should not be outlawed, that compensation capping is helpful. But do you think that we should take a stronger stance? Literally, it's written, we don't think that the regulation to cap should be outlawed. Should we go further? Should we say we believe in capping? Should we say that it serves the interests of the intention of all of the parties involved to do that? I mean, this is one of the questions that we're seeking feedback from.
I'm sorry, go ahead. You know, I've evaluated donors and surrogates for years. I mean, my name is Patricia Mendon, I'm a therapist in New York. And, you know, we argue with this mental health people all the time in terms of particularly donors, you know, the issue of coercion. And all of us have evaluated donors that have charged more. obviously less as well. And you know what, you can kind of look at it from a donor's point of view, which is it's a free market, it's an antitrust, you don't put caps on it. I also will say, are there people that are always going to pay because of that? And I would probably tell them as a therapist, having evaluated a lot of donors, your donor from Harvard may not be your best donor.
You never
and
know.
so people, you know, when I look at donors, a lot of it is I'm doing evaluations and really looking, you know, they be smart, but they gotta have their feet on the ground and know how to take the SOA, you know, kind of thing, which I think is a lot of times, some of them don't. And also some of them, I think, you know, don't really understand what's involved. Are there people that have paid? Yeah, but I have a feeling that, you know what, in many ways, it really regulates itself for the most part. You get people that are a bit more, yes. And people then have to decide whether they'll pay more. And sometimes a donor actually will sit on for a long time because nobody's paying for it. And I've had donors actually screw themselves up where, you know, they charged so much and then ended up with a hormonal level that actually, you know, prevented them from donating, and somehow I sometimes think there's a God that does that. But that said, have I had people that charge, and if somebody could, they were wonderful? Yeah, but I think, you know what, you as a couple or an individual have the right to pay or not to pay. And for some donors, you hope that the agency and the medical facility and the, you know, the psychological are going to do the correct evaluation and the legal, because the reality is sometimes these donors, I mean, I will never forget when my son was 17, there were donors starting to charge money way back then, and he's now 30. And, you know, on my coffee table was a donor that was a Stanford donor, beautiful, like, I think it was $35,000 at the time, and I'm looking at this, that was way back then, that was a long time ago. And my son picks it up and sees this gorgeous young woman and says, wow, and I said, you can't afford her. and he threw it back on the table. You know,
Yeah.
But the reality is, and guess what? When they eventually did her evaluation, she really wanted to do all of this, and the idea of it was wonderful. But then there's a lot more that goes into it. So, you know, as much as I think, you know, the cap is, I also think that at times people do regulate themselves, and your Harvard donors, just because it's, you know, like it's all that, a lot of them don't even answer any of those ads because they're not interested in that stuff. So it's an interesting piece when you look at this. There's a lot more regulation, I mean, a lot more stuff.
Yeah, and it's also really, you had an interesting point, because I think when we were looking for our donor, we wanted to make sure we met her first. And it was literally seeing her interact with her son. That was the thing that we were looking for, that whatever that it gene is, it was in this wonderful person, and it was just because of who she was. And how can you, you know, how can you know that you're going to get that if a price is higher? I mean, it's kind of irrelevant.
Do the evaluation. It's like you really do, if you're able to really ask all those different questions and meet them, you get a lot of information about a family. And so you can have like a star in the family, and the rest of it you're going, and you're wondering whether where the gene pool is flying. There are a lot more, and I think if we can get people educated as to what that's all about, I think this cap kind of thing, you know, it's just not, you know, people get worried about it, but I think donors will end up, sometimes the donors are really greedy, is going to price themselves out in the market.
I mean, the only other issue with that is it can create, and we're very sensitive to this after the European experience, it can create the impression of you know, going to the highest bidder and opening yourself up to the kind of criticism that you're going to get for that.
If you remove the cap.
If you remove the cap, yeah, yes.
But speaking of surrogates, I'm a mom via gestational carrier, and I was just saying to Brian earlier, I spent the summer in Maine and Connecticut, which are both surrogate-friendly states, and people would ask me, oh, you're going to have another baby, and so I said, oh, no, it's very different. I had a number of people approach me who were still in touch with me about, you know, I always thought about being a carer, I didn't know what it was. And it's a very different type of woman that you would think, and I think actually, where there really is a shortage for a variety of reasons. A lot of people are like, I don't want to be tagged as doing it for the money. But you know what, for me to do it for $30,000 is not really quite enough for me to convince myself. So I do think, you know, for those that are intended mothers and have been through this process, sometimes we have people who will approach you as like, I'm the golden uterus, as we call it. And, and there are people willing to pay. But I do think there's a difference between capping the donors and capping the surrogates. And I think also too, well, we don't want a business deal, but there is something to be said for the you know, we all get pay increases, and I think those levels have kind of stared. But I've seen more people coming out of the woodwork that maybe it's the economy, I don't know what it is, that are considering it that I think 5 years ago may not have. But I think that the levels were a little higher. And again, market forces, because not everyone's gonna have that extra $15,000 to take the $30,000 surrogate and bring her to 45 and whatever, but that's my thought on it. But I was very, very surprised at the number of people that are, I mean, I don't know if they would pass muster, you know.
Yeah, and that is one of the reasons.
Well, they all seem
Where
to
you-
have very, I mean, they were, my daughter was in camp for 5 weeks, and we were in Maine for, and I know these people, but they all seem to have very textbook pregnant. I'm not a doctor or anything, but this is not someone that I met on the street, but it was very interesting because they were continuing the conversation. And of course, I know nothing about their medical history other than
For psychological.
Right, or psychological.
right, exactly, right, exactly.
Well, let me get to that a little bit. I want to go through briefly, just touch on some points on the baseline protocols. The baseline protocols, which start on page 4. The first is informed consent, and the second is medical screening. And pregnancy has inherent medical risks. We know this. We know the unfortunate stories that we just heard from, I think, Utah. It behooves all parties involved to understand informed consent and medical screening. But ensuring that donors and surrogates understand everything prior to entering into a contract. It really helps dispel the notion that anyone is being taken advantage of, which is one of the things that the Surrogates Advisory Board, they're very adamant about knowing that they're entering into this without being taken advantage of, and they want that to be installed in the baseline protocols. And also legal representation on number 8. And the question that I put out, and this is one of the most provocative questions, we have dealt with this in both the baseline protocols, but also in the best practices section, about asking, is there truly independent legal representation if you're going to a one-stop shop and they're arranging everything for you? Now, the truth of the matter is many agencies have networks of attorneys that they have worked with, they've worked with successfully, and they are the attorneys that have the knowledge necessary to represent a surrogate mom in a different state. But if the agency is arranging for that representation, is there a temptation on the part of that consulting counsel to negotiate, perhaps not necessarily on 100% behalf of the surrogate mother? So that's a big question that we really want to open up for comments on the draft. And if anyone has any comments now, I welcome them, but I also want you to take time to look through that and to look through how we've distinguished it in the best practices section, where we talk about not wanting to, to have referral fees coming back, and to get more specific, fully, it's the last on page 9, fully independent counsel, and I'll just read this and then I'm going to open it up. We state, while our baseline protocol states that surrogates should have effective independent legal representation, it should be noted that definition of independent might not always be clear-cut. We recommend that the attorneys representing each party do not have any formal financial affiliation or interest with each other or in the coordinating agency, including partial ownership by the attorneys and their immediate family. In addition, they should not offer or receive a referral fee from one another. Now, this gets into a really sticky area. This is not baseline protocols. Agencies who have these who have this type of affiliation, they're not barred from working with men having babies. But we want a couple or an individual who's an intended parent to be able to go to the agency and say, I have this concern. How will you address it? And then put it to the agency to make sure that they are giving the information, satisfying information to the intended parents, so that they understand that their surrogate is going to have independent counsel. So you were gonna say something.
Well, I was going to say, when I was going through my surrogacy journey, we were looking at attorneys for the carrier, and my agency said, "Oh, we'll call so and so. He's cheap and easy."
Oh God.
And so, well, right, and so it was kind of like,
That's kind of a red flag.
That doesn't really sound very good. Well, we were already in the process, and
Yeah.
my whatever did not go very well. But there was a situation where the agency, which is still in business and is very big. They own the agency. They wrote, thank you for saying earlier today that, you know, getting outside counsel to look at when they're doing the contract between.
Yeah.
And so they basically gave us someone and never vetted her properly. We found out when she was 11 weeks pregnant that she had falsified all this information, so on and so forth, and blah, 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 blah. Only by the fact that I had an OB who had done her residency in LA, had seen surrogacy, and said this is the worst case I've ever seen. She didn't refract. I won't say the state because it will give a lot of information. And my goal is not to bring people down, but just to empower people. And I've actually created a Bill of Rights for intended parents. It's not as comprehensive as this, but it touches on these things. Because people, I'm the pause button, because people really, you want that baby yesterday, you're passionate. So when you hear these things, you're not necessarily thinking about this, and like, and you have this professional in front of you, and they're like, well, we've done this before, and there are no problems. They're not going to share the problems with you. But I do feel that the carriers often do get the short end of the stick because they might be getting the less, either the less, what am I trying to say, established attorney or the, you know,
And they're also often limited to where the agency will be in a different state and the surrogate will be a different state, and there may be not necessarily as many informed attorneys in that state
That's right.
as well.
That's
So
right.
it's an interesting.
But she does seem to kind of get the, like, you know, you get so-and-so and.
We get cheap and easy, yeah.
Yeah, and that never really sat very well with me, and I always approached it from the fact of, I would pay my surrogate, well, not after I knew who she was really, but beforehand I would have done anything. But I was very clear from the beginning that I would not be held hostage.
Yeah.
You were, unfortunately.
Brian.
The interesting thing that you don't say in here is that you think there should be more of a separation between counsel for intended parents and matching agencies, because I've had a handful of people over the last year contact me because their agency is assigned them a lawyer and the lawyer gave them a contract and nobody's really explained the contract to them. And you know, they're sort of, and so then they're hiring yet another lawyer, you know, and me to talk to them about, you know, what this contract is, you know, are there provisions in it that they would want or don't want. And you know, I've seen things like this, you know, the carrier in this instance was in Wisconsin and the intended parents were in New York. And the agreement said that it could be interpreted under the laws of either New York or Wisconsin, which, I mean.
Oh my God.
You know, you think like, who
drafted that, yeah.
Like, you know, like there's, you know, I think there's, you know, some of these agencies I think they're using a dearth of qualified counsel, you know, even when they're owned by attorneys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough call because you have possibly competing interests involved. And one of the things that we wanted to do and have done with the Surrogates Advisory Board is to float the idea of them giving us information on the attorneys that they worked with. And if they had a positive experience with them, to sort of do a review so maybe that they can create a pool of attorneys that their surrogate can draw from, that has a track record representing surrogates, successfully representing surrogates. So that they can, and that this is all very first stage kind of stuff that we're talking about. But we're raising the questions, and we're trying to make sure that intended parents understand what the ethical snags can be and how they can have the best possible journey. I just spoke this entire time and I didn't let you say a word. I'm so sorry. This is supposed to be a discussion and it's literally me talking. But do you tell us about any input that you have? What would you like to add to the conversation?
No, I think
from a psychologist's point of view.
Yeah, well, I think actually from a mental health perspective, the thing that was most powerful to me was that hearing from surrogates from the Surrogacy Advisory Board. They said that the piece that needed a lot more attention was the psychosocial support, and that to really engage in an ethical journey, it needs to have more psychological support, not only for the surrogate, but for any other members of that surrogate's life who is impacted, so primary partner, children, etc. And I think that, as a practitioner, that's really important to me to hear, because it means there needs to be more outreach and more emphasis on that for people going through the journey. And I think it's something that a lot of agencies don't adequately address currently. So I think both as a gay dad through 2 gestational processes, and also as a member of the board, that was really valuable to consider.
Yeah, and to hear that coming from the surrogates, we really took their comments very seriously and tried to add them in. So that's the introduction. You know, one question that I want to put out to everybody here is, who else's input do you think we should seek? Remember, keep in mind that this is for intended parents, but are there any other people that we should target this to get their feedback from that you know of? And what changes, again, this may be after you've read through it, what changes do you think we can make to what we have here to strengthen it and further define the journey? So I welcome that answers to that question, but I do realize that it's a dense document, and I want you guys to take some time with it. And if you really do have specific comments, just send us an email, and we'll send you a Word version so you can redline it. You know, if the survey function on our website isn't adequate enough for you. But I really do appreciate you all being here to participate in this conversation. It's initial, it's important, and it's one of the directions that we want to take men having babies.